whisper in the fog. That's how it started. A message half buried in mist, tangled in secrets no one dared name aloud. Somewhere between science and silence, a quiet betrayal unfolded beneath the polished floors of diplomacy. This isn't a tale of blood and bullets, but of ciphers, shadows, and a truth too dangerous to speak. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. Let's begin the story. It was upon a damp and darkening evening in the latter part of October, the year being 92, when I found Mr. Sherlock Holmes in one of his more restless moods. The fire crackled in our Baker Street sitting room, though it seemed to provide little warmth to my friend, who was pacing between hearth and window with a fury born not of energy, but of intellectual starvation. 3 days had passed since the resolution of the Single-Stick Club forgery, a case that taxed neither his reason nor his interest, and left him, as he often put it, caged but unchallenged. The table beside the armchair was cluttered with correspondence, pleas from sentimental widows, disgruntled tradesmen, and the occasional fraud wrapped in respectability. Holmes had dismissed each with a flick of his long fingers. "I require a case, Watson," he said at last. "Not a complaint, not a misunderstanding. A case." At that very moment, as if summoned by Holmes' will alone, there came a brisk knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson, ever discreet, appeared with a telegram upon a silver tray. "A wire, sir. Foreign," she murmured. Holmes took it with a sudden spark in his eye, and I noted at once the seal, Austrian in its flourished script, with an official stamp from Vienna. He slit it open with his penknife, read it in silence, then handed it to me with a twitch at the corner of his mouth. "Baron Wilhelm von Kreutzhofen," he said. "Now that is a name I have not heard since the Bosnian affair." I adjusted my spectacles and read aloud. "Urgent matter requiring immediate discretion. Englishman, Arthur Hemsworth, found dead at Westbahnhof Station. Circumstances dubious. Local authorities uncooperative. Only clue, burnt note in German. Request your presence. Baron von Kreutzhofen." I looked up to find Holmes already at the mantelpiece, fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes narrowed as if seeing far beyond the room. The name Hemsworth was unfamiliar to me, but the inclusion of a partially destroyed note and a request from such a particular source was enough to signal danger, diplomacy, and deception all bound in one. "Interesting," Holmes murmured. "Very interesting indeed." Holmes retrieved the Baron's message and examined the final line once more. His lips twitched in that peculiar way they often did when a puzzle had sunk its hooks into him. "A burnt note in German," he mused. "The best kind. Half a cipher and wholly a clue." He moved to his writing desk and drew out an atlas, thumbing swiftly through the pages until he located Vienna. "Tell me, Watson," he said without turning, "how often does an English chemist die abroad, under natural causes, yet leave behind a cryptographic postscript in a foreign tongue?" I had no answer, and he clearly did not require one. By the time I had refilled our glasses and seated myself once more, Holmes had already scribbled a terse reply and rung for Mrs. Hudson. "We shall require passage to Vienna, first light," he said plainly. I raised an eyebrow. "Without further inquiry?" "There is no inquiry required, my dear Watson. Only travel." I watched as he sealed the envelope with an elegant snap of wax. "A man is dead, a note is burned, and a baron I distrust seeks my presence. That trifecta cannot go unattended." He turned toward the window, gazing into the London fog as though peering through to the spires of a city not yet reached. "And besides," he added, "Vienna in October has its charms." It was perhaps 2 evenings following the receipt of the Viennese telegram when a most distinguished gentleman presented himself at our Baker Street chambers. Mrs. Hudson, whose instincts for social hierarchy were as finely tuned as any diplomat's, ushered the man in with the deferential air usually reserved for foreign royalty. He was tall and spare, With a trim military moustache and the pale complexion of one unaccustomed to sunlight, his uniform, though civilian, bore the silent rigour of a man long acquainted with brass buttons and field dispatches. He introduced himself, in clipped tones, as Baron Wilhelm von Kreutzhofen, attaché to the Austro-Hungarian embassy and former officer of their strategic command. Holmes, who had been playing with a loose thread in his dressing gown, stood at once and offered the Baron his chair by the hearth. "I did not expect you in person," Holmes said, with a flick of the hand toward the Baron's boots, which bore the unmistakable slush of the Calais line. "Nor I," the Baron replied, "but the dead do not always wait upon protocol. My government has framed this as a matter of unfortunate circumstance," the Baron began, his voice pitched low, as though even the wallpaper might be listening. "An English chemist, Mr. Arthur Hemsworth, aged 42, died 2 days past on the west platform of Vienna Westbahnhof. The cause, it is claimed, was apoplexy. Yet you do not share this conclusion," Holmes said evenly. The Baron inclined his head. "Hemsworth was no tourist, Mr. Holmes. His passport claimed he came to study architecture. His hotel ledger listed novels and cafe bills. But I assure you, he dined once with a Russian consul and spent 2 afternoons inside a building used, unofficially, by our Ministry of Armament." I glanced toward Holmes, who merely steepled his fingers and murmured, "Curious." "During the war," the Baron continued, "Hemsworth was attached to a chemical research group working in Austria under secret accord. Though that cooperation dissolved years ago, certain formulas linger." "Formulas?" I asked. The Baron gave a tight smile. "Compounds of volatile potential, best left forgotten." Holmes closed his eyes for the briefest moment. "And yet, it seems," he said quietly, "someone remembered." "Mr. Hemsworth was seen at precisely 6:38 in the evening, purchasing a railway schedule and a small parcel of oranges," the Baron recounted. "He appeared pale, nervous, but physically well." "He was travelling?" I inquired. "That remains unclear. No ticket was found upon his person, nor baggage. Minutes later, he was discovered seated on a bench near platform 7, his head slumped forward, lips slightly parted. No witnesses saw him fall." "The body was examined?" Holmes asked. "A cursory inspection, no signs of violence. Local physicians were satisfied with natural causes." Holmes made a quiet sound of disapproval. "Physicians are too often romanticists when science fails to show its hand." The Baron's jaw tightened. "I trust you understand, Mr. Holmes, that a British subject dying in such fashion, in such a place, raises questions best not left to Austrian newspapers." Holmes gave a small nod. "It is not the death that concerns you, Baron. It is the implication that he did not die alone." The Baron did not respond, but his silence was eloquent. "Among Mr. Hemsworth's effects," the Baron said, removing a folded sheet from his leather satchel, "this was found." He handed Holmes a brittle scrap of paper, browned at one edge as though singed by fire. The handwriting, angular and dense, was unmistakably German. Holmes scanned it, his eyes flicking with intensity. "Dies weiter Walzer um 9 Uhr," he translated aloud. "We were wrong at Koigbrook. No more delays." The mention of Koigbrook stirred something faint within me, though I could not place it. "Koigbrook," Holmes echoed. "A name that does not appear in Baedeker, but one that resides in the footnotes of war." He handed the note to me, then turned to the Baron. "Was this all?" The Baron nodded. "No signature, no envelope, torn along the bottom." "Deliberately," Holmes murmured. "Burnt, perhaps, to obscure a name or a destination." He stood and stretched with the deliberate motion of a cat upon waking. "It is an invitation, Baron. The question is, to whom?" Holmes sat once more and studied the Baron with that same detached focus he once reserved for a particularly complex beehive. "You knew Hemsworth, of course," he said suddenly. The The Baron's eyes narrowed. Not personally. Yet you carry this case across the Channel, at great personal risk, and speak with a tension that no diplomat can mask. The Baron stiffened. I act in service of the British Crown. No, Holmes said. You act in service of a memory. The room grew very still. Your concern, Baron, is not political, Holmes continued. Hemsworth's presence in Vienna was not sanctioned by Whitehall. Of that I am certain. Yet you received him. You watched him. And now you protect his name. The Baron's gloved hand clenched involuntarily upon the arm of the chair. Was he a friend? Holmes asked. After a pause, the Baron replied, he was trusted by someone I once trusted. That is enough. Holmes leaned back, satisfied. There it is, Watson. Loyalty, tangled with diplomacy. It always makes the cleanest facts the dirtiest messes. The fire had burned low by the time the Baron took his leave, his features shadowed, but his spine unbent. As the door clicked shut, Holmes remained standing in thought, the cryptic note still between his fingers. You believe him? I asked. I believe, Holmes said quietly, that his words were edited, but his urgency was not. He moved to the window and stared into the London fog beyond. There is something oddly theatrical about the whole business. A chemist who dies with a note in his coat, a baron with a vanished connection, a musical reference, and a place whose name only exists in classified footnotes. I gave a small chuckle. Theatrical, and yet you're tempted. My dear Watson, he said, turning back to me with a familiar gleam in his eye. You mistake me. I am not tempted. I am enthralled. So we go to Vienna. We go to Vienna, he said. Not for queen or country, but for something far more compelling. What's that? Holmes smiled. For the pleasure of asking a question no one else dares answer. We arrived in Vienna beneath a leaden sky and the whistle of eastbound express trains. Westbahnhof stood before us like a fortress of soot-streaked stone and iron, its columns braced like the arms of a slumbering giant. There was something distinctly martial about its presence, appropriate perhaps, given the hush that had settled over the city since the death of Arthur Hemsworth. Holmes, as ever, disembarked with no more luggage than his pipe case and notebook. He took a single breath, narrowed his eyes, and strode off into the terminal with the air of a man hunting a scent no one else could smell. I followed close behind, notebook in hand, knowing from experience that even the smallest remark from a customs official or railway clerk might form a part of his evolving mental map. It is here, Holmes said at last, pausing near platform 7. Somewhere between this track and the waiting bench, Hemsworth's journey ended, and someone else's began. After some initial resistance from the station staff, whose cooperation was clearly filtered through layers of diplomatic unease, Holmes managed to locate a senior porter who had been on duty during the evening in question. He was a wiry man named Huber, whose cap sat too large upon his crown and whose eyes darted from us to the shadows of the station hall. Yes, I remember the Englishman, Huber said in halting English. He looked like a man who wished to be invisible, but who forgot how to disappear. Holmes cocked his head. Go on. He came early, around 6, maybe just before, sat on the bench, read a page of his book. Then she came. She? Huber nodded. A lady, or so I think. She wore a veil, black netting over her face, spoke German to him, low, fast. They argued, not loud, but sharp. And then she left. He stayed, looked around like a man who'd lost something he hadn't meant to drop. Holmes thanked him with a tip of the hat, then turned to me as we stepped into the corridor. A woman with a veil, he murmured. Not a disguise, a signal. We made our way to the consulate later that afternoon, where Holmes was given access to the effects recovered from Hemsworth's person. There, in a brown envelope marked Nicked Relevant, he found what he had suspected all along, additional fragments of the burnt note the Baron had earlier presented. With the precision of a chemist and the reverence of a scholar, Holmes laid them upon the desk and began aligning torn edges like puzzle pieces. The ink was faded, but Holmes's magnifying lens brought the words into clarity. Die zweite Walze, Konzert, 9 Uhr, Koigbrook, keine Umkehr. The second waltz, concert, 9 o'clock, Koigbrook, no turning back. He tapped the final phrase. This was not a note of invitation, he said. It was a summons, or perhaps a confession. I ventured. A meeting arranged under code, or a reckoning, Holmes replied. He folded the fragments carefully. I shall take them with me. Paper, unlike men, does not lie when scorched. Later that evening, as we sat in the consulate's drawing room, nursing tepid tea and colder theories, Holmes stood abruptly and crossed to his valise. From it, he withdrew a slim volume marked Dispatches, 1917, which he had packed with the foresight of a man who rarely forgot a name. He flipped through the pages swiftly, pausing at a notation beneath a date I recognized. April the 3rd, 1917. There, he said, jabbing a long finger toward the text. Koigbrook Munitions Testing Center. Incident reported, Formula G12B unstable under thermal compression. 3 fatalities. Investigation sealed. And G12B? I asked. Holmes's eyes glinted. A chemical compound of potential use in incendiary warfare. It was abandoned, or so the record claimed. He closed the book slowly. We were wrong at Koigbrook, he repeated. Wrong in calculation, wrong in secrecy, and perhaps wrong in who we trusted to bury the mistake. A shiver crept down my spine that had nothing to do with Austrian weather. At Holmes's urging, I called the Hotel Riesenhof the next morning and requested a quiet word with the nurse who had attended Hemsworth during his stay. A matronly woman with practical shoes and sympathetic brows. She remembered him well. He was polite, she said, and generous with his compliments. But toward the end, he changed. In what way? I asked. She pursed her lips. Jumpy, distracted. He kept the curtains drawn, even at breakfast. Asked if any telegrams had come for him when none had. Said he thought he was being followed, though he never saw who. Did he mention any names or destinations? Only once, she said. He muttered it while staring into his tea. Too late now, he said. They already have the formula. My pulse quickened. Did he mention Koigbrook? She hesitated, then nodded slowly. Yes, but only in a whisper, like it was a ghost. I thanked her and made my way back to Holmes, the chill in my bones deepening with every step. Later that day, Holmes proposed we take our lunch at a small cafe off the Ringstrasse, one of those modest establishments which serve excellent strudel, and, as Holmes observed, a better view of the street than the street has of it. We had scarcely settled at a table when Holmes leaned toward me, his voice barely above a whisper. The gentlemen seated by the front window, he said, without glancing in their direction, are both in the employ of the Österreichischer Geheimdienst. I nearly choked on my coffee. You're certain? Elementary. The one on the left reads his newspaper upside down, and the other has polished the heel of his boot with a handkerchief that still smells of pipe ash. An affectation taught only to field agents trained in disguise. But why watch us? I asked. They are not watching us, Holmes replied, brushing a few grains of powdered sugar from his sleeve. They are watching to see who we notice. And have we? We have now, he said with a thin smile. And they'll report that we are 2 tourists discussing pastry, quite accurately, I might add. We walked back toward our lodgings beneath a sky the colour of pewter and the soft clang of distant tram bells. Holmes walked with his hands clasped behind his back, head bowed slightly, as if conversing not with me, but with some invisible equation unfolding in the air before him. Watson, he said at last, we are not dealing with a murderer, in the conventional sense. I looked over, puzzled. You mean Hemsworth wasn't killed? I did not say that. I said we are not dealing with a murderer of passion nor of profit. This is a death by consequence. Consequence of what? Of a secret, too long buried and now improperly exhumed. Let me put it another way. Imagine a powder placed in a sealed jar, left undisturbed for years. It is forgotten, misfiled, perhaps labelled in error. But one day, someone stumbles upon it, opens it carelessly, and is destroyed. He paused. Now replace the powder with a formula. Replace the jar with a man's conscience. You believe Hemsworth came to Vienna not for pleasure, I said slowly, but to contain something or someone. Holmes gave a slight nod. He realised too late that what they had developed at Koigbrook did not die in fire or bureaucracy. It lived, in notebooks, in memories, and in those with more loyalty to profit than to peace. I said nothing for a time, watching the fog rise above the chimneys. And now? I asked. Now, Holmes said. We find out who else remembers what they were supposed to forget. Our journey to Koigbrook was not an easy one. The railway line that once served the district had long since fallen into disuse, and it was only by hiring a local cart and enduring several hours of bone-shaking travel through damp, pine-choked paths that we arrived at the edge of that desolate village. A heavy mist clung to the earth like gauze over a wound, and the stillness was broken only by the call of distant crows. Holmes had scarcely spoken during the ride, save for a single remark regarding the terrain, that it was the sort of ground one might bury not only mistakes, but the men who made them. We passed half-collapsed sheds and hollowed barracks, the skeletons of a war that had moved on but left its ghost behind. There was no inn, no cafe, only a weathered sign with the village name and a rusted gate barring the way to a fenced-off tract of land. This, Holmes said, adjusting his gloves, is where the silence began. Let us see if anything here still speaks. And with that, he stepped through the gate. Inside the boundary of the former testing ground, the vegetation had begun its slow reclamation. Ivy crawled over broken cement, and weeds pushed defiantly through what remained of walkways. Yet there was a structure that still stood, a squat stone building, half sunken and windowless, with its door ajar. Holmes entered without hesitation. Within, the air was thick with mildew and rust. Dust motes danced in the slanting light, and shelving units, warped and splintered, held a sparse collection of papers, files, and broken glass instruments. Holmes moved through the space as if revisiting a crime scene, each step deliberate, each drawer opened with care. At the rear of the chamber, he found a small cabinet secured with a rusted lock. A deft flick of his blade broke the mechanism, and inside lay a brittle ledger, names, dates, formulae. Holmes leafed through quickly, pausing at one page. Arthur Hemsworth, he said quietly. April 1917, Compound G12B, Test 3, Joint Authority, Markova, Hemsworth. He tapped the margin. And here, a black line drawn through the entry, not struck for correction, but for concealment. What was tested here? I asked. Something, Holmes replied, that could not be explained in peacetime. Back at the derelict facility, Holmes paced among the chalkboards, making sense of what little survived. He spoke as if reciting from memory rather than conjecture. G12B was designed as a volatile dispersant, not unlike a gas, but denser, heavier than air. The objective was to deliver incapacitation without permanent damage. But the tests, as you see here, produced unexpected results. He pointed to a charred fragment of wall. Overpressure, chemical reaction, fire. From the ledger, he read aloud. Test halted, 3 fatalities. Personnel relocated, site restricted. I shuddered. And this was buried? Of course, he replied. The war was ending. No government wishes to advertise accidents when peace is at stake. He paused, then added, But some formulas never disappear. They linger in the minds of those who created them, Hemsworth, for instance, and if the whispers are true, perhaps in the notebooks of others, which makes their rediscovery a temptation too great for certain parties. You believe someone wanted to retrieve the formula? I believe someone already has, Holmes said, and Hemsworth, perhaps racked by guilt or fear, returned to Vienna to prevent its use. But failed, I said. Holmes gave a nod. Fatally. It was late in the afternoon, and the mist had begun to thin when a figure emerged from the far end of the path. She walked slowly, deliberately, her coat drawn tightly around her and her face uncovered. For the first time, we saw her clearly. Elena Marova, Holmes said without surprise. She inclined her head. I hoped you would come. She was striking, not in the way of beauty, but in the intensity of her gaze, the kind of woman whose intellect did not require introduction. You were his partner? I asked. And more, she said softly. Holmes gestured for her to speak freely. I warned him not to return, she said. He believed he could retrieve the pages, speak to the right men, stop the spread. But it was too late. The formula had already been copied. By whom? Her lips tightened. There are people who deal in such things. Science for sale. Nations who pretend to be civilized but pay well for shadows. And you? Holmes asked. She looked down. I came not to stop him, but to say goodbye. I feared what might happen if he succeeded, and I was right. Do you fear for yourself now? Holmes asked. No, she said. Only for what comes next. We took shelter beneath a crumbling stone awning as a cold drizzle began to fall. Elena stood with her arms crossed, her voice low and steady, as Holmes questioned her gently. Not with accusation, but with calculation. I met him the night before he died, she said. In Vienna, near the station. I had heard, through channels best left unnamed, that fragments of our old work were circulating. Copies of the Koigbrook notes. They had turned up in private hands. Dangerous hands. Russian? Holmes asked. She gave a delicate shrug. Russian, French, perhaps even Austrian. These are matters of currency now, not allegiance. And Hemsworth. He was frightened, not of being discovered, but of what he might have started. He believed he could intercept the transaction, retrieve the fragments before they were sold. But failed, Holmes murmured. Yes, he left me that evening with a promise to act. I never saw him again. Holmes's eyes narrowed. And you? I came to warn him, she said. Nothing more, yet you vanished after his death. She met his gaze. Would you have stayed, Mr. Holmes, in a city where secrets are bought like cigars and disappear like matches? We returned to Vienna that same evening, weary and mud-splattered, our minds heavy with revelations and questions not yet answered. Holmes wasted no time in requesting another audience with Baron von Kreutzhofen, who received us in his study with the same formality as before, though now his eyes betrayed a weariness that no polished boots or crisp cuffs could conceal. Holmes observed him keenly as he recounted our findings in Koigbrook, the ledger, the formula, the veiled woman's warning. The Baron remained silent throughout, his fingers laced tightly before him. You were aware of the Koigbrook incident, Holmes said at last. I was, the Baron admitted, though the details were sealed before I attained my current position. Holmes's smile was faint. Yet not so sealed that you failed to recognize the name Hemsworth. The Baron exhaled. I recognized the danger. That is why I contacted you. No, Holmes said gently. You contacted me because you feared being implicated. The Baron stiffened. Are you accusing me? Not yet, but I suspect your knowledge of this affair exceeds what you have admitted, and that your reluctance is not born of diplomacy, but of debt. To whom? Holmes stood. To the dead, perhaps, or to the living whose silence you've protected for far too long. The following morning, Holmes roused me before sunrise with the news that I would be returning to London, alone. Mycroft must be made aware of what we've uncovered, he said, handing me a sealed envelope bound with twine and marked in his precise hand. This is not for diplomatic channels. It must go directly to him and into no other hands. I turned the packet over. May I ask? You may, he replied, but I shall not answer. I sighed. So I am to deliver a message I cannot read, regarding a danger I only half comprehend. Holmes's eyes softened, or rather became momentarily less cold. Watson, your comprehension is exactly what keeps you safe. Trust me, there are corridors even you should not walk. I took the envelope with a nod, understanding more from his tone than his words. And what will you do? Holmes smiled thinly. I shall remain. The Baron has secrets yet to surrender, and I intend to be present when they rise. As I boarded the train that afternoon, I looked back toward the city, its rooftops blanketed in haze, and wondered what ghost Holmes intended to drag into the daylight next. It was nearly a week after my return to London when I received Holmes's telegram. Return to Vienna at once. Velvet, gloves, deception, all will unfold. S.H. I did not hesitate. By the time I reached the Palais Theatre, a marbled cathedral to music and pretense, Holmes was already inside, or rather, his latest persona was. Baron di Castiglione of Naples was not a man I had heard of before, but judging by the admiring whispers and frequent bows he received that night, he was well known in the right diplomatic circles. The man wore a velvet opera cloak, white gloves, and an expression of supreme indifference, that he was, in truth, Sherlock Holmes of Baker Street beneath it all. Well, only I knew that particular aria. He had warned me that the ball was not for pleasure but entrapment. The note was no metaphor, Watson, he'd said. The second waltz is a signal. It will be played tonight, and those watching will answer. I kept to the periphery, following Holmes's instructions to observe but not intervene. I intend, he had added, fastening a ruby pin to his cravat, to catch a ghost in full dress. The orchestra paused after a spirited polonaise, and a murmur passed through the ballroom. Then came a rustle of silk, a hush of anticipation, and the haunting lilt of Strauss's second waltz began to swell from the musician's corner. I knew at once what it meant. So evidently did Holmes. He stood near the eastern alcove, conversing lazily with an Austrian diplomat's wife, but I saw the angle of his head change subtly, the slight tightening of his gaze as he scanned the gilded room. I followed his glance, and though I was less adept at espionage than Holmes, even I noted a stirring among the crowd. A man by the refreshment table who folded his napkin with mechanical precision, a woman near the terrace who touched her brooch twice in quick succession, and, most notably, a servant in livery who seemed suddenly far too alert for a footman. Holmes moved then, gliding through the crowd with effortless elegance. He paused beside the string ensemble for a fleeting moment, offered an offhand compliment to the conductor, and then drifted toward the western corridor. I followed discreetly, pulse quickening. Something, someone, was about to move. The music rose to its crescendo, and Holmes turned suddenly, his eyes fixed on the footman. He gave the slightest nod, not to the man, but to me. The trap, I realized, was about to spring. I confess, dear reader, that I had believed, as had many, that Baron von Kreutzhofen himself was the focus of Holmes's suspicions. Certainly his guarded answers and reluctance to name names had led me to consider the man compromised, if not complicit. But as Holmes intercepted the so-called footman in the narrow passage behind the musicians' gallery, I realized just how wrong I had been. "Kramer," Holmes said softly, his hand resting lightly on the man's arm. The man flinched. "Excuse me, sir. I am expected in the wine gallery." Holmes's grip did not tighten, but neither did it loosen. "You're expected, certainly, but not by anyone awaiting refreshments. By your Russian contact, perhaps? Or the gentleman who left that envelope in the umbrella stand this morning? I stepped forward, stunned. Kramer, the Baron's valet? I'd seen the man twice before and thought him a background figure, as forgettable as wallpaper. Yet now I saw the slight bulge beneath his collar, the fresh ink stain on his cuff. Signs I had missed, but which Holmes had catalogued without effort. You were clever, Holmes said, too clever. Hemsworth trusted the Baron, and so he never noticed the servant who set the bottle in his room. Kramer's expression soured. You have no proof. I have timing, I have motive, and I have a musical signal to which you alone responded. At that, the man pulled free and darted down the corridor. Now, Holmes muttered, the waltz becomes a chase. Kramer fled with remarkable speed, disappearing down a service corridor behind the stage drapes. Holmes pursued without hesitation, and I followed, as best I could, into the dim recesses of the Palais's underbelly. The air below was dense and warm, laced with the metallic tang of old piping and the acrid breath of boilers long overdue for maintenance. We descended narrow iron stairs, passed beneath timber rafters and coiled ropes, then entered a labyrinth of tunnels which once, Holmes later informed me, had connected the theatre to an adjoining bathhouse, long abandoned and now sealed. I heard footsteps echo ahead, rapid, desperate. Holmes quickened his pace, pausing only to remove his gloves and slip something small and metallic into his right palm. A whistle blew faintly behind us. Someone had alerted the theatre's security, yet Holmes, far from waiting for them, accelerated. He knows the layout, I panted. Then so must we, he replied. Follow the left wall. He'll make for the boiler access. It's the only unlocked exit. And indeed, as we rounded the final bend, a flicker of movement ahead confirmed it. Kramer, lit dimly by a red glow from the furnace corridor, was forcing open the last iron hatch. Holmes darted forward. Your waltz is finished, Mr. Kramer. Kramer turned with a hiss, his hands curled as if to claw his way through us. But Holmes was already between him and the exit, the red light casting deep shadows on his face. The moment hung for a heartbeat, the air filled with heat and the soft throb of distant engines. You will not get out that way, Holmes said. Nor, I suspect, by any means at all. Kramer's mouth worked, then shut. He stared at Holmes with a mix of hatred and resignation, a man who had run too far and finally met the wall. You've nothing, he spat. Holmes smiled. On the contrary, I have your movements, your meetings, and the key you lifted from Hemsworth's luggage, the one you used to access his notes, which you then copied. You can't prove... I can prove that Baron von Kreutzhofen's telegrams were intercepted and altered before reaching the Foreign Office. I can prove that you sent a false message to lure Hemsworth to Platform 7, and I can prove, if I choose to open your satchel, that it contains at least one scrap of paper written in Hemsworth's hand, and another in Russian cipher. Kramer faltered. Let me offer you this, Holmes added. Speak now, and perhaps you'll live to see another embassy's boiler room. Kramer swallowed. Then, with the strange calm of a defeated man, he said, It was never about the science. It was always about the silence. Holmes turned to me. Do make a note of that, Watson. We emerged into the servants' wing at the rear of the Palais, where Baron von Kreutzhofen awaited us with flushed cheeks and eyes darting between Kramer and Holmes. You've taken him, he said, his voice tight. Holmes gave a small nod. He ran, which I find generally to be an indicator of guilt. The Baron stepped forward. This will cause diplomatic tremors, Mr. Holmes. Do you understand what you've done? Holmes raised an eyebrow. I have removed a traitor from your staff, Baron. I assumed that was your intention in summoning me. The Baron's lips parted, then closed. Yes, of course. But it was not your only intention, Holmes said. You knew who Kramer was, or at least suspected, and yet you did not act. I had no proof, the Baron replied stiffly. You had no courage, Holmes corrected, and perhaps, if I may be so bold, no desire to stain your hands with the filth your position attracts. Kramer, who had remained silent until now, gave a bitter laugh. He protected me because I was useful and because I was invisible. Enough, the Baron snapped. Holmes turned to him. You let Hemsworth die, Baron. You knew Kramer was dangerous, and you said nothing. The Baron met Holmes's gaze. He served my country. Holmes's expression did not soften. No, he served himself. In your name. And you let him, because to stop him would mean confessing you were blind. There was silence. Then the Baron, ever the soldier, straightened. Do what you must. I already have, Holmes said. The music above us, dulcet and oblivious, continued to glide through the Palais Theatre as Holmes and I stepped back into the main corridor. The laughter of noblemen, the clink of glasses, the rustle of silk, none betrayed the treachery that had unfolded just beneath their polished shoes. Kramer was escorted by 2 security men, his face empty of expression. The Baron had vanished somewhere into the shadowed parlours, his shame tucked tightly beneath the folds of protocol. I walked beside Holmes in silence for a time, until the great entrance hall came into view. Well, I said, Vienna does not lack for drama. Holmes allowed a rare flicker of amusement. Indeed, though I find I prefer the performances that do not end with handcuffs. We stepped outside, where the smoke of the city mixed with the chill of early evening. Holmes drew a long breath and looked upward. They will cover it up, he said. The embassy, the Austrians, even Mycroft, in his way. Then what have we accomplished? We have interrupted a sale, prevented the revival of a dangerous formula, and exposed a man whose silence killed a friend. That's not justice. Holmes shook his head. No, Watson, it isn't, but it's the closest we're allowed. A gust of wind carried a scrap of music from the open door behind us. The waltz was ending. Come, Holmes said, let us find something that burns brighter than politics. And what's that? He gave me a thin smile. Truth, however briefly it flickers. It was the following morning when Holmes, having slept barely an hour, summoned us all to the drawing room of the British consulate in Vienna. The windows were closed against the March chill, and the heavy curtains drawn. A single coal fire gave the room its warmth and its shadows. Present were Baron von Kreutzhofen, seated stiffly on the edge of a leather armchair, Sir Neville Harrington of the Foreign Office, a man with the sharp eyes of a hound and the patience of a judge, and Colonel Beckwith of military intelligence, whose moustache bristled with every word Holmes uttered. I stood near the fireplace, notebook in hand, while Holmes paced the centre of the rug like a tutor before indifferent students. This matter, gentlemen, Holmes began, was never about Hemsworth's chemistry, not directly. It was about how he recorded his work, and what shadows that method cast upon other men. Sir Neville raised a brow. You mean the note? Holmes nodded. The note, the music, the peculiar phrasing. They were not the ramblings of a distressed mind. They were a cipher. And Kramer? Asked Beckwith. A parasite who recognised value without grasping its danger, said Holmes. But let us start at the beginning, with a melody and a glass of schnapps. The Baron flinched, a barely perceptible motion, but Holmes saw it. Do take notes, Watson, he said. This is a story that begins with poetry and ends with poison. Holmes drew from his pocket a folded sheet of thick paper, the now infamous note found in Hemsworth's pocket. He laid it flat on the table between us, smoothing its creases with fingers that moved, I thought, with a curious reverence. The second waltz will summon the king, he read aloud. The silence below the 4th stair will guard the flame. We were wrong at Koigbrook. Mourn what cannot be sung. Colonel Beckwith snorted. Nonsense. On the contrary, said Holmes, it is exacting nonsense. Nonsense with internal structure. He tapped the page. The references to waltzes, stairs and silence. They correspond to musical phrases. The second waltz is not a dance, but a tonal sequence, A progression in D minor that Hemsworth used to encode formulas during the last stages of the war. A musical cipher? I asked. Precisely. Hemsworth believed that only something abstract and emotionally driven, music or verse, could mask data in plain sight. This note contains the coordinates of a compound he had only begun to stabilize. It also contains a date, a meeting location, and the initial of a courier, K. Kramer, the Baron said, his voice subdued. Holmes inclined his head. The valet, who could not read poetry, but who understood the value of secrets, Sir Neville leaned forward. And Koigbrook. Holmes's smile was thin. That is the key to the rest, and the very reason Hemsworth had to die. He turned to me. Watson, do you recall the scar on Hemsworth's left hand? Yes, a burn. Not from carelessness, Holmes said. From memory. I had assumed it a laboratory injury, I admitted, but clearly it carried more meaning. Holmes steepled his fingers. Koigbrook was a field experiment during the 11th month of the war, a desperate attempt by both sides to weaponize compounds derived from accelerated oxidizing agents. Hemsworth was sent as part of a neutral scientific council, but the test failed. In what sense? Asked Beckwith. In every sense, said Holmes grimly. A miscalculation led to the compound becoming unstable in atmospheric conditions. It combusted in a field hospital, killing 6 orderlies and a young Austrian nurse. The scandal was buried, conveniently so. I glanced toward the Baron, who was suddenly very still. Hemsworth never forgave himself, Holmes continued. He returned to England determined to prevent a recurrence. What he wrote in that note was not only a cipher, it was a confession. Sir Neville frowned. So Kramer was after the old compound. After the possibility of refining it, Hemsworth had hinted, in private correspondence, that he'd discovered a way to stabilize the reaction. I said, but wouldn't that make it even more dangerous? Exactly, Holmes replied, which is why Kramer, or those who employed him, could not afford to let Hemsworth deliver his findings to the British Defence Laboratory. Baron von Kreutzhofen finally spoke. And what of the girl? Holmes turned slowly toward him. The girl, Baron? The nurse, he clarified. Her name was Annalise. There was a pause. Her death, the Baron added, broke something in him. Holmes gave a faint nod. It also built something. Guilt, sharpened into obsession. An obsession, as we've seen, leaves a most distinctive trail. It was not the compound that killed Hemsworth, Holmes resumed. It was chloral hydrate, colourless, tasteless, deadly, in sufficient quantity. Beckwith frowned. But the death certificate cited exhaustion and respiratory failure, Holmes said, which would be consistent with Hemsworth's condition, or with the ingestion of a powerful sedative delivered in alcohol. Kramer brought him the schnapps, I said slowly, recalling the untouched bottle on the nightstand. He did, Holmes nodded, and ensured that the dosage would mimic the effects of stress-induced collapse. It was a tidy death, if not a clean one. Sir Neville rubbed his forehead. Why not simply steal the formula and vanish? Holmes answered without emotion. Because Hemsworth would have raised the alarm, because only a dead man's documents can be explained away as personal notes or posthumous theories, and because Kramer, though clever, lacked the finesse to forge Hemsworth's entire body of work. He needed the real papers, and the illusion of a natural end. The Baron's jaw clenched. I trusted that man. No, Holmes said quietly. You tolerated him. There is a difference. There was a heavy silence. Holmes drew from his coat a second document. Hemsworth's true will, retrieved from a locked drawer Kramer had overlooked. He left this with his solicitor, Holmes said. It includes a letter to his niece, warning that if anything happened to him, she must destroy his Viennese notebooks. And did she? I asked. Holmes gave the faintest smile. No, she posted them to me. Sir Neville let out a low whistle. Then we have them. Holmes met his gaze. No, you do not. England does. And with that final distinction, the reckoning was complete. It was not until the officials had retired to examine the seized documents that Holmes turned his attention to Elena Hemsworth, who had waited in a neighbouring room during the entirety of the confession. She entered at Holmes's request, her expression poised, though her hands trembled faintly. "My dear Miss Hemsworth," Holmes began with a crispness that surprised even me, "I must commend you for preserving your uncle's final wishes, even when doing so placed you under suspicion." Her eyes widened. "I was a suspect." "Unwittingly," Holmes replied. "You concealed the note, delayed notifying the authorities, and made inquiries at the theatre, all acts consistent with someone attempting to obscure guilt. But your intention was quite the opposite. You sought to protect his legacy, not profit from it." She looked down. "I only wished to understand. He was the kindest man I ever knew, and yet so tormented." Holmes's gaze softened by a margin. Men of science often carry their failures more heavily than their victories. In his final act, he entrusted you not with a formula, but with conscience. She met his eyes. "And have I been cleared?" "Officially and entirely," Holmes said, "though I dare say your presence in diplomatic circles will be requested again, this time with thanks rather than questions." A faint smile flickered at her lips. "Then may I go?" Holmes bowed his head. "Go, and carry no shame for having loved a man who made one terrible mistake in the name of peace." After Elena's departure, Holmes requested a final word with the Baron von Kreutzhofen, who lingered in the study with the distant expression of a man reviewing ghosts. "You knew of Koigbrook," Holmes said without preamble. The Baron inclined his head. "Not the full extent. Only that something went wrong, and that Hemsworth never forgave himself." "You protected that knowledge," Holmes continued, "even when a man died, and another betrayed his oath under your nose." The Baron was silent for a moment. "I protected stability." "Stability?" Holmes echoed. "Or reputation?" The Baron did not flinch. "They are one and the same in Vienna. Our peace is not written in treaties, it is stitched in silence." Holmes' gaze sharpened. "That silence cost a man his life, and perhaps spared others," the Baron countered. "If the formula had fallen elsewhere," Holmes held up a hand. "You speak like a politician, Baron. I prefer the language of facts." A long pause passed between them, and then the Baron said, "You are fortunate to serve a country where truth and honour are still permitted to converse." To my astonishment, Holmes gave a dry chuckle. "No, Baron, I serve a country where they quarrel, often, but I have the advantage of knowing which of them to trust." The Baron lowered his eyes. "You will report me." "I have already reported the facts," Holmes said. "What men do with them is their own indictment." We left the consulate just as the evening bells began their quiet toll across the rooftops of Vienna. Holmes walked ahead of me, his coat drawn close, his steps deliberate, yet lacking his usual briskness. I sensed in him a rare quietude, not the kind born of satisfaction, but of reflection. "That was neatly done," I offered, catching up to him. Even Beckwith seemed impressed. Holmes gave a non-committal grunt. "And yet," I ventured, "you look as though you've lost a game rather than won one." He stopped before a narrow hallway where a soft melody drifted faintly from some upper parlour. A waltz in a minor key, lilting and sorrowful. "It was the second waltz," he murmured, almost to himself. "The cipher?" I asked. Holmes nodded, and the metaphor, Hemsworth buried truth beneath music, not to mislead, but to mourn. I regarded him in the half-light. "You believe he wanted someone to find it?" "I believe he hoped no one ever would," Holmes said, "but he feared the alternative more." There was a long pause, and then he added, almost absently, "Music is a peculiar thing, Watson. It appeals to something reason cannot reach. Perhaps that is why it unsettles me." I smiled. "You unsettled? That is rare." It is not fear, he corrected. Only resonance. We resumed our walk, the echo of the waltz fading behind us like the last note of a question unanswered. And for once, I did not press him further. The morning of our departure from Vienna was a quiet affair, as though the very air conspired to keep secrets buried in silence. A pale mist lay low across the ground, curling through the trees and railway tracks, veiling the city's baroque charm in the indistinct silver of regret. Holmes, ever punctual, stood on the platform in a posture of complete stillness, his hands clasped behind his back and his eyes fixed on the horizon beyond the rails. We boarded the Calais-bound train without ceremony. Holmes, for once, declined the customary newspaper and made no comment on the timeliness of the engine or the quality of the carriages. He sat by the window, his gaze lost in the drifting fog and the slow motion of a countryside waking under clouded skies. I knew better than to disturb him. In such moments, Holmes was not merely silent, he was elsewhere, traversing thoughts I could never follow, in a world made not of facts, but consequences. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels had become almost hypnotic when Holmes stirred at last. Without turning, he spoke in a tone that was oddly detached, as though addressing no one and everyone at once. There is a curious irony, Watson, in the fact that men have ceased to fight with swords and begun instead to duel with silence. I glanced at him, but he did not shift his gaze. We live now in an age of shadows, of papers, whispers, poisons. No charges fired, yet men fall. No declarations made, yet nations tremble. You mean espionage, I said. Espionage, science, diplomacy, all cloaked in civility, Holmes replied. The tragedy lies not in the deceit, but in the intelligence wasted to sustain it. We employ our brightest minds not to illuminate, but to obscure. And Hemsworth? I asked gently. He nodded once. A man who understood too late that truth, when smothered by duty, turns venomous, and with that, he resumed his silence, not bitter, but resolute. As we passed through Linz, I offered Holmes a small parcel from the dining car. Strong Viennese coffee and a slice of sachatorte wrapped in wax paper. He accepted it absently and took a sip, his eyes narrowing as if tasting more than flavour. You've been uncharacteristically quiet, I ventured. Vienna seems to have left a mark. He gave a short breath of amusement, though his expression remained unreadable. Vienna offers many things, Watson, he said, swirling the coffee idly in its tin cup. Coffee, music, and treachery served at room temperature. I blinked. That sounds like something you might embroider on a cushion. Holmes allowed the corner of his mouth to lift. One must find poetry where one can, even among poisoners. His reply left me unsure whether to laugh or shudder. I chose silence, and the train rolled on beneath a clouded sun. It was 3 days later when we returned to Baker Street, our boots damp with English rain, and our minds still fogged with remnants of the Austrian affair. Mrs. Hudson had left a letter upon Holmes's desk, thick, official, and sealed in unmistakable crimson wax. Holmes broke it open with his usual economy. He scanned its contents with an inscrutable expression before passing it silently to me. The signature at the bottom read, Mycroft Holmes. Another puzzle? I asked. Holmes was already walking to the mantel to refill his pipe. Tell me, Watson, he said, packing the tobacco with gentle precision. Have you ever visited Lisbon? I sighed. Should I be concerned? Only if you value your sleep, he replied dryly. As I pen the last lines of this account, Holmes sits by the window, his violin across his knees, and a fresh telegram already crumpled in his lap. He has not played a note, not yet. He is waiting, not for melody, but for momentum. Some men rest after victory. Holmes is not such a man. He requires the friction of mystery, the sharp edge of contradiction to remain whole. Without it, he unravels in silence. A machine, without tension. The case of Hemsworth and the cipher of Koigbrook is closed. Its ghosts now belong to Vienna, and yet, already, the scent of Portugal stirs in the air. Lisbon awaits. Holmes and I sat in silence as the train rattled toward Calais, the mist still clinging to the window panes like the last reluctant secret of the affair. I glanced at him. His eyes were closed, but his mind, I knew, was turning. "At what point," I asked, "did you first suspect the valet?" Holmes opened one eye. "When I noticed that the Baron trusted him absolutely. True loyalty," he said, "is often blind, and blind men seldom see the poison in their glass." He turned back to the mist and added, "The great tragedies, Watson, rarely announce themselves with drama. They arrive in silence, wrapped in duty, and leave behind the faintest scent of betrayal." I said nothing. There was nothing to add. He gave a thin smile. "The case is closed, and yet, I wonder, what would have happened had Elena spoken sooner, or if the Baron had chosen truth over image?" Then he looked at me and, as if speaking to the night beyond the glass, murmured, "What do you think was the criminal's greatest miscalculation? Was it the forged telegram, or the belief that silence could protect a lie forever? What do you think? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every theory with keen interest, and if you enjoyed this mystery, do consider subscribing for more cases from Baker Street. Tell a friend or two. One never knows who might hold the next clue. Let the game continue.